All right, great. So, so my background is actually in plant pathology. I didn't really have as much of a research career as I was head of programs providing grants for researchers at the North Carolina Biotechnology Center. But I've been a master gardener for more years than I can count, I think. And so I have learned a lot about dirt and soil. And what a few years ago, we moved to a new house. And so I'm starting over from scratch after having worked in a same house for 30 years and building that soil. So I had to start over. And so one of the things that I've always learned is that the best way to really learn something is to try to teach somebody else. And so that is one of the reasons I selected this as a topic. So what we're going to talk about today is a little bit about what soil is, some of its compositions and characteristics, then some things you can do to understand what your own soil is all about. Talk a little bit about soil physics and soil chemistry, very little bit, but just enough to get your understanding about that. A lot of these things you've probably heard before, but sometimes when you hear them over again, all of a sudden it's like, oh, now I get it. Now I understand what that means. And part of putting this talk together, I was like that. Oh, yeah, okay, now I understand cation exchange capacity. So hopefully I'll give you a couple of aha moments throughout the talk. Then the all-important reason why you're probably here is how can you improve your soil? And I want to spend a little bit of time about different kinds of soil amendments and mulch. I'll summarize what I think are the important takeaways. I have a couple of acknowledgements. I'll provide you with a couple of additional resources. And then if there's additional questions and answers at the end, I'll be happy to try to answer those. So first of all, has anybody ever thought about what is the difference between soil and what we call dirt? Well, somebody once said to me, well, that is soil, that dirt is dead. Well, yeah, technically it's non-living. Dirt is just inanimate. It's minerals or whatever soil that's in a place you don't want it. They use the term soil for dirt, the dirty things, but that's not really what soil is. What soil is it is actually alive. Soil is a combination of minerals, air, water, animals and microbes, all kinds of other living matter. The plant roots are in the soil, and the waste and decaying bodies of these various organisms. I saw this interesting statistic, and I think it's worth pointing out. I just want to check. Can you see my pointer as I move it around? Or not? Not really? I can't hear that.
I see.
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yes.
Okay. So soil contains a teaspoon of healthy soil. So that is a small amount, a teaspoon, not a tablespoon, contains up to 1 billion bacteria. But in addition to that, there are roundworms and protozoa, yeasts and all different kinds of fungi, microscopic insects. And then, of course, you have all your larvae from your flies and beetles and just all these different things in 1 teaspoon of healthy soil. So where do our soils come from? Well, in North Carolina and the Southeast, our soils are derived either from the eroded mountains or from ocean deposits. And as I'm sure you are all very aware, we have 3 distinct geographic regions in the state. We have the mountains, we have the Piedmont area, and of course the coastal plain. But within each of these areas, there's more than one type of soil. The U.S. Soil Conservation Society has determined there's something between 14,000 and 20,000 actual detailed soil series descriptions in the United States, and 450 in North Carolina alone. There's 22 types in Wake County, and I think I have half of those in my own yard. Where do these different kinds of soils come from if they're just from mountains or ocean deposits? Well, in addition to the parent material, these soils are acted on by the climate. So you have rainfall, you have temperature, other aspects of climate that are going to affect the different physical properties. It's also going to affect what kind of biological activity is in a particular soil. You're going to have different microbes and insects and organisms that live in a certain environment. And those things all interact with each other. In addition, topography can play a role. What's at the top of a hill is going to generally be eroded down to the bottom of the hill. So generally valleys, you always hear of fertile valleys. Well, that's because all the good soil came from the top of the mountain down to the valley. And so that's what makes those valleys so fertile. So all these different factors play into creating different soil types in various different niches. And then the final factor is time. It takes a long time for these soils to form, on the order of 500 to 1,000 years. And you're like, oh no, what am I going to do in my yard? I don't have 1,000 years to wait. Well, we're going to talk about some sort of shortcuts you can take to help improve your soil. But the first thing you want to do is understand, what do you have? So today we're going to talk about 3 different physical properties of soil that will clue you into kind of what you have and maybe what you can do about it. So there's color, texture, and structure. Starting with color, that's just easy to observe. You go out and you look at your soil and you can see what color it is. If it's light in color, that's usually an indicator that there's very low organic matter present and that there's a high sand content. And that's because leaching occurs and the sand does not hold on as water washes some of those nutrients away. Dark color, on the other hand, has a high organic matter. It can also indicate a situation where you might have poor drainage. Red, which we are very familiar with, I'm sure many of you are, of our beautiful red clay, generally means that there's some oxygen in it because it shows that there's iron oxides and that iron has been oxidized. So that's generally what red means. But sometimes you might find gray clay, and that shows that there's been inadequate drainage going on. And I think I have all of these in my yard. So what are the differences between clay and sand and maybe silt? You've heard of silt. Well, these are the different particles that make up what we call soil texture. Texture refers to the relative amounts of these different sized particles that make up the soil. So the percent of sand, the percent of silt, and the percent of clay together make up your texture. Now, the bad news is there's really nothing you can do about your soil texture. Very difficult to change it. If I were to say, if you have clay and you say, well, what if I just bring in some sand to make my clay better? To change the amount of, to add the amount of sand you would need to change the property and texture of your clay, if I were to say you need a ton of sand, I would be lying because you'd need 100 tons of sand. It would take an incredible amount of different type of particles to actually change, to affect a change in your type of soil. But what you want to know about these different characteristics of these different soil particles is that in addition, let's start with sand. So you have, sand is huge compared to clay. So they have different sizes. So sand is about 0.1 millimeter to 1 millimeter in size, depending on how fine your sand is. Silt is much finer. It can be anywhere from 0.002 to 0.05. And clay is minuscule. Clay particles are so small that they are actually, you cannot see them individually. But the other thing to notice about these sizes is it's going to have a role in both the soil chemistry and the soil physics that take place with your soil. So if you take the same weight of each of these types of particles, so if you take a gram weight of sand, and that can vary whether you have fine sand or a coarse sand, but a gram weight of sand is going to have a certain amount of surface area. So that's the area around each particle. If you add up all of that together, you would have between 11 centimeters square and 200 and something centimeters square per gram of sand. Quite a bit more, about double that at 454 for silt. But when you get to clay, because the particles are so tiny, you actually will have 8 million centimeters square of surface area. So that indicates that clay can be very reactive, both physically and chemically in different ways. So that tells you something about your soil. So a little bit more about these different particles. is that they can have different properties when they're in different conditions. So clay is very hard when it's dry and slippery wet. It's slow to drain. The aeration is can be poor. Can have poor aeration and slow drainage. The individual particles, as I said, are not visible, but clay has a high nutrient holding capacity and a high buffer capacity. And this is just an electron microscopic picture showing you that the particles of clay are actually these flat plates, and that makes them very sticky and they stick together. Silt, on the other hand, is very floury when it's dry, slippery when wet, but you can see the individual grains. It has a moderate buffer capacity, and it is able to release and retain water very readily. It has somewhat more fertile than sand, but not as much ability to hold nutrients as clay. And it also has particles that's round rather than these flat plates. And then sand, you're very familiar with, I'm sure. It's gritty, it's kind of angular in shape, it drains quickly, has a loose structure, does not have a lot of organic matter. It also has a low buffering capacity, but it has very good aeration. So each of these different types of particles can bring something to the mixture of soil that you have. Now, you've probably also heard about loam. And just so you understand what loam is, it's actually a mixture of these three particles, 40% sand, 40% silt, and 20% clay. And very often, loam is a very desirable type of soil for gardening in. So one thing you can do to understand a little bit more even about your soil and what your soil texture is to do a sample. And you can look this up. I'll give you brief instructions how to do this, but it's all over the internet. You can find videos and instructions on how to do the mason jar soil texture test. What you do is you go out in your yard, dig a sample of soil from a particular area, put it in a jar about a third to halfway full. But before you do that, you want to sift out any large particles, soil, rocks, or other debris. And then put it through a sieve to make it a little fine, get all the clumps out, put it in the jar and add water and a surfactants. You want to add a tablespoon or so of dry dishwashing detergent, or you can also use you could alternatively use a squirt of dish soap. My understanding is the dishwasher's detergent for some reason is supposedly better. I don't know why, but you shake it up and you let it sit. And what's going to happen is in about 2 minutes, the sand falls out. And you can come back and mark it with a marker. And then about 2 hours later, the silt will settle. And then it takes about a day or two for the clay to settle. You can add all these up and figure out then the percentages of each type of particle you have. You can then find online what they call a soil texture and go to that, and with your estimates of the percentages of what you have, you can determine what your soil texture is. So let's say we look at ours and we say, oh, well, I've got about 50% clay. So you look at the clay side and you find the 50, and maybe you have a 20% silt, and you come and bring those lines together and say you have at least about 30% for sand, and you end up on this thing and it says, wait, I have clay. Well, that's because clay is going to be the predominant property of that type of soil. Other types of soil you might find if you have a higher percentage of sand, like a 50% sand with 50% clay is going to be a sandy clay. So you can do this and just figure out what kind of texture, and that will tell you a little bit more about the properties of your soil. Another thing to understand about soils is that it's not just what's at the surface, what's underneath makes a difference as well. And when you look at the profile, is what it's called, or they're called soil layers or horizons, as you look down at these different layers or horizons, and that will give you what's called a soil profile of your particular soil. This isn't as easy to do unless you have special tools for it, but it's good to understand what it is. So the top layer is called the O horizon. That stands for organic. That's where the organic debris and leaf litter is. Below that is the A horizon, and that's your surface mineral horizon, and it also includes the organic matter that's accumulated there. And hopefully it has a nice rich color. Below that is the subsurface, which is usually the organic material below, usually clay in our area and other compounds. And then below that are other layers. You have the parent materials and bedrock. The top two layers, the O and A horizon together, is what is considered your topsoil. So in our area, a very characteristic series is sometimes referred to as the Cecil series, has certain characteristics, and that is that we have a very shallow top layer, natural top layer, a topsoil layer, very narrow. And that's because of the climate that I told you is one of the factors that plays into making different kinds of soil, is that we have high heat and a certain significant amount of rainfall. And what that does is both those things help to turn over those microorganisms, the organic matter, so that it breaks down quickly. And it also, with the rainfall, can leach the nutrients away. And so that's just one of the characteristics of the soil around here. We also tend to have soils that have low pH, that tend to be more acidic in nature. So the next characteristic of your soil is what's referred to as the structure. The structure of soil refers to the grouping of individual soil particles into larger clumps or aggregates. And a good structure includes not only clumps of material, but also channels, air channels and pores that will allow the rapid movement of air and water. This is a diagram of what the ideal soil should look like. You would have about 45% mineral content, about 5% organic material, and then 50% pore space, of which half would be made up of water and half air. So that's your ideal soil. But what so happens so often in our neighborhoods and settings that we're trying to garden in is they've been compacted. This comes from many sources, mainly the construction process really compacts your soil. They often scrape away all of that topsoil, leaving you with nothing but subsoil to start with. Might bring in some other soil from elsewhere, but generally it's really not that very good topsoil. They've had heavy machinery on it. You might have an area the kids play on that can compact it. Some people park along the side of the road in front of their house, so that would help further compact it. So lots of different factors can compact your soil. And what happens when you have compacted soil is that you squeeze out that air. The water is sort of able to hold its own. It can maintain there, but the air pores are squeezed out. And so what you end up with is only 5% air, and your mineral content, just because the air pores are squeezed out, gets compressed together. So you have a higher mineral content, but the organic matter goes down as well. The microorganisms don't like this kind of compact material. They need air, they need space. So they will kind of slow down and you won't get much organic matter turnover in this kind of soil. Similarly, a poorly drained soil, the water is just going to sit in the pores and take up the place of where the air would otherwise be. So what can you do to improve the structure? This is the thing that you can do to improve your soil overall. You can improve the structure. What you want to do is add organic matter. And I'm going to mention this over and over throughout the talk. This is definitely the one takeaway. Organic matter matters. It will help improve both the physical and the chemical nature of your soil. It helps to hold nutrients. It increases the cation exchange capacity, which I will try to explain to you because I sort of understand it now myself. It will improve moisture management and will support microbial population. So organic matter does a lot. what goes on is that there's this constant nutrient availability that's in a give and take with the soil, with your plants, and you have the living organisms in there. They start breaking down fresh residue. As they break down this residue, the active process of decomposing them causes this organic matter to build up and become available. The nutrients become available to your plants. So that's called the chemically active state. The nutrients are chemically active, actively available for your plants. It then further decomposes into a stabilized form called humus. And at this form, it's not able to release any more nutrients. They've all been released. So it's called passive. But this is still important because the stabilized form helps with both your soil structure and your soil moisture. So let's talk a little bit about the soil chemistry now. So we've talked about some of the physical properties. So chemical properties of your soil that you're interested in are the pH, which is the level of acidity or alkalinity in your soil, the soil fertility, which is the amount of nutrients that are available in your soil, and this cation exchange capacity. One of the things that we highly recommend you do that's great for learning about your soil is to get it tested. So you can do this by getting a soil test kit from the North Carolina Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services Agronomic Division, which is on Reedy Creek Road. You can get the kits from the Master Gardener office. And basically what these kits are, they include a cute little box that you put together and a form. And it gives you instructions. And it tells you how to go collect samples. You can turn in multiple samples from different places in your yard. You want to have different samples depending on what you're growing. So if you've got a vegetable garden and a flower garden in different areas, you want to test those separately. You might have an area where you're growing shrubs. So you can do as many soil samples as you want, and you put them all separately into individual boxes. You come up with a little code, and you fill out that code and identify it and turn in this information. Now, the most important thing you want to do with your soil sample is to include your information here, but especially a legible email address. That's because that is how they're going to contact you. They're going to send you the information by email, and that will send you to a link to be able to read your report online. And what this report will tell you is it will give you nutrient balance of minor and major nutrients, and it will tell you about your pH. The important thing to know is that this test is free from April through November. And that's because the later months from December through March is when the farmers are testing their soil. So they want to give the farmers priority. So it's not free at that time. So the things that the soil test will tell you is, as I said, the nutrient balance as well as the pH. It will give you recommendations. It will tell you, depending on what you're growing in a certain area, whether you need to adjust the pH in a certain way or whether you need to add specific nutrients. So I said I would tell you a little bit about the cation exchange capacity of your soils, and just kind of want you to understand that really all this means is that there's this balance with the nutrient availability in your soil. Soils have a binding sites on them because they're negatively charged, and they will then ionically bind charged particles. So if you think back to your high school or college chemistry, ions are particles that have a charge. Those that have a positive charge are called cations, and those that have a negative charge are called anions. And many plant nutrients have these charges, and soils are able to only bind those that have a positive charge because they have a negative charge. And if you recall, positive and negative charges attract each other, and that's what holds them. So this is not a strong bond, it's just an ionic bond. And so it's easy to break this bond depending on the conditions. So there's this constant movement of bound particles from the soil into the soil solution, and then it can be taken up by plants. Now, the compounds the nutrients that are in the soil solution can only be taken up by the plants if they're in solution. If the soil is dry, the plants, even if the nutrients are there, the plants cannot have access to it. It must be dissolved in the soil solution. So that's something to think about with the optimal amount of soil moisture. Now, different types of soils have different cation exchange capacities. And the higher the number is better, because what happens is this acts as a bank or reserve and holds onto these nutrients until they're needed. So clay has a pretty good CEC of about 30 or above. Loam is so-so, is about 5 to 15, and sand is really poor, only 1 to 5. But the key here is that if you add organic matter, you can increase that cation exchange capacity up to 200 to 400, and that's good. So it acts as a bank and will hold on to those nutrients. So it holds them and keeps them in reserve, so you'll have to fertilize less often. And I just also want to mention that only the positive nutrients are what can be bound. That's why you often have to add different nutrients over again, because they get leached or washed away because they can't be bound to the soil particles. All right, so the microbes in your soil, each different soil is going to have its own composition of microbial species, and that's called the microbiome of that particular soil. And these microorganisms, as I mentioned, do a lot of work for you. They're nature's decomposers or recyclers. They help regulate that nutrient availability, that give and take in the soil, making those nutrients available to your plant. They also exude different compounds that help with the soil structure by making sticky compounds that help with that aggregate formation. Other things that they exude include different chemicals that they put out into the soil that can act as plant growth promoters, weed suppressors, help with nutrient retention. Some of them might produce compounds that help with pathogen and pest protection. They regulate the carbon in the soil carbon dioxide and dissolved carbon. They also help buffer the acidity and alkalinity in your soil, and a select few are able to actually fix the nitrogen from the atmosphere to make it available to plants. And that's only certain plant bacterial combinations. So what other factors affect the soil nutrient supply? So we talked a little bit about moisture. Too much, the nutrients won't dissolve. Too little, the nutrients won't dissolve. Too much, leaching can occur. We talked about air. Air is needed in soil. Roots need air. The microorganisms need air. So air is important. The pH, we talked about that. That's a measure of the acidity. The pH can have an effect on what nutrients are tied up or released. They might be in the soil, but they're not available to the plant if the pH is not right for that plant. The microbes will break down, and I already talked about them, how they can change the soil chemistry by releasing these different compounds, and also that they break down the organic matter and make nutrients available to plants. The temperature is important. That can have a role. The warm temperatures increase the microbial activity and speeds decomposition, whereas it will slow down when the temperature is colder. There's also a balance that happens, and this is something that you can learn from your soil test report. If you have too much or an imbalance with certain nutrients, they become unavailable. And just an example here is that if you have overlined your soil, you have too much calcium, that can cause actually an artificial deficiency in potassium. Whereas if you have too much potassium, it will prevent the uptake of calcium. So all of these things interact with each other. So how can you improve your soil? Well, I'm going to start with telling you some of the things that you should not do. Because first of all, remember there's no quick fixes. It's not going to happen overnight. You don't want to dig your soil when it's really wet out. What happens then, especially if you've got clay and you're starting to build that structure, you dig into that, you're going to collapse those pores. So that will destroy your structure when it's really wet. So you don't want to dig when it's really wet. I already mentioned about sand and clay, how difficult it is to change your soil texture. A lot of people think that if you just add sand, it's going to loosen it up. It won't. It will actually reduce your pore space and you'll end up with cement or concrete. You don't want to add peat moss to clay. Both of clay, as we said earlier, has a very high capacity for holding on to moisture. Well, so does peat moss. And so mixing the two, you can create kind of a soggy issue where that might not have been too much of a problem before. And it's also difficult to just add topsoil, especially if you're trying to do your whole yard. There can be many issues with bringing in soil from an area that you don't really know where it's coming from. A lot of fill soils come from landfills or construction sites, and industrial sites. And so you don't know if it has weeds in it, other toxic contaminants, heavy metals, pathogens. So you're just really asking for more problems by just bringing in soil. It's better to try to fix what you have. Also, adding a layer of one kind of soil on top of bad clay, for example, is going to cause drainage problems. Water tends to pool at interfaces where things come together and change from one type of soil to another. And what will happen is the roots will go down to that level, the water will sit there and at the compacted layer, and you can actually have plants drowning, even though the top of your soil might be drying out. Where they're sitting is in water. But what can you do? There are things, and I've mentioned this already, and I said I was going to mention it multiple times, and that is to add organic matter. Organic matter is the key to improving your soil. You want to do it consistently every year. Two of the best materials are pine bark and composted leaf mold because they have a lot of nutrition in them. And they don't break down too fast, but they break down at a good rate for the soil microorganisms to flourish. You want those soil microbes and organisms that are in your soil to naturally improve your structure over time. They're going to do the work for you. Other steps you can take is to try to minimize compaction wherever possible, to try to fix any drainage problems you have so that you can minimize erosion. And you can also add mulch to the surface. So I just want to talk about the distinguishing thing between adding mulch to the surface and incorporating organic matter. So one is adding things into the soil, the other is putting it on the surface of the soil. And I just want to show you, these pictures are from Gina Myers, who was able to amend soil in her garden over several years. And it went from this to this in just a matter of about 3 or so years. So it can be done. So I've said there's a difference between amendments and mulch. So the main difference is that amendments are mixed into the soil. So you want to do that before you're planting, you mix that into your soil. Whereas mulch is placed onto the soil surface. There can be both inorganic and organic amendments and inorganic and organic mulches. But the key here is only organic mulches and organic amendments are going to build your soil. Some types of inorganic amendments include inorganic fertilizers, or perhaps you might consider permatil or vol block as sort of amendment. It helps a little bit with drainage and it helps to protect against voles. Again, inorganic mulch will not build your soil. Some people use it for different reasons. And then there's compost, and compost can be used as an amendment or as a mulch. And what compost is it's a product that's created by the breakdown of organic waste under conditions that are manipulated by people, and it's used to improve both the texture and the fertility of your garden soil. A more simple definition is decayed organic matter used as plant fertilizer. So let's talk a little bit about fertilizers. We already said you've got your soil test done, you know what you need to add. So in some cases, if you need to add something really specific, you might want to do an inorganic fertilizer. I'm starting to trip over my words. These are fertilizers that are derived from petroleum products. They are made with precise chemical formulas, and they will feed your plants directly. They can provide you with rapid, precise nutrition. However, they will not build the soil. And if you misuse them and add too much, you can cause harm to both your plants and the microbes in the soil. Organic fertilizers, on the other hand, include things such as manures and compost. They feed the soil. They actually do not feed your plants directly. They are slower and more variable. They require the microbes to break them down and release those nutrients that can then feed your plant. But they will also help build your soil. They will help with that structure. I'm going to say this again. Soil microorganisms must process the organic compounds to make them available to your plants. So that's the difference between these kinds of fertilizers. Now, the plant itself, once that nutrient is available, it doesn't know where it came from. It doesn't care whether it was an organic source or an inorganic source. Once it's there, it just says, I need nitrogen. Here it is. It's identical to the plant once it reaches the availability to it. You generally want to get manures that have already been composted. They're going to be safer to use. They've been treated with specific procedures to make them composted. So there are different kinds of mulch that you can use on your soils. We talked a little bit about kind of organic mulches, and some people different kinds of organic mulches, and there's also some that are inorganic, such as lava rock or crushed stone. Those can have their place. Some people like the way they look. They can still add benefits by reducing weeds and moderating soil moisture loss, but they're not going to build your soil. The things that make a good mulch are factors such as you want something that's going to moderate the soil moisture. It's going to keep the moisture in, but you want it to be able to dry out enough so that it doesn't stay soggy. You want something that looks nice, that's not going to wash away, that's weed-free and not phytotoxic. Different kinds of mulches that are organic include shredded wood, shredded bark, pine straw, straw hay, and leaves. I mentioned phytotoxic mulch. What does that mean? Well, sometimes if the mulch is not stored properly, it can turn sour and anaerobic, and then the organisms can produce some toxins and things that can burn tender plants in certain conditions. And so, for example, if you've got a huge mulch pile that's fresh and it gets rained on, those organisms can start churning and decomposing inside, and that can turn it sour. So you want to make sure that you store your mulches in good condition, keep them dry until they're being used, will help protect them from turning sour. In addition, some mulches can actually be a little bit inhibitory to certain plants, and a study was done over at NC State that showed that pine straw can actually stunt pansy growth in certain conditions. So that's just something to be aware of. Thought that was kind of interesting. If you're growing a lot of pansies, you might want to mulch around them directly with something other than pine straw. So what are the benefits of mulch? There are many. It reduces soil erosion on slopes, especially if you use the right kind of mulch. You want something that's not going to wash. So something like the shredded bark or pine straw will do good on slopes. The nuggets will wash away, so that's not the best thing to use on a slope. They can help reduce soil compaction. If you've put down a good layer of mulch, you can feel it's kind of spongy a little bit when it's first put down. So that can help reduce compaction. And then, of course, as the soil it breaks down and builds the texture, that will also, the structure of your soil, that will also help with reducing compaction. As I mentioned, organic mulches will add to the structure and provide nutrients. Mulches moderate the soil temperature and will protect overwintering roots of perennials. It will help to reduce heaving in the freeze-thaw cycle. and will help to conserve moisture in your soil. But wait, there's more. Mulch can keep fruits and vegetables and flowers clean from soil splatter. They can prevent soil spores from infecting plants, from being splashed up onto your plant. I just want to mention, though, with camellias, it's always a good idea to replace that mulch every spring because the pathogens that cause camellia blight can overwinter in that mulch. Mulch can protect your tree trunks from mower and trimmer damage by keeping you away from having to get too close to your trunk of your tree. It prevents weed growth and makes those that do come in easier to pull, and it also improves the appearance of your landscape. They will control annual weeds, but be aware that mulches do not control perennial weeds. These are weeds that grow from roots and tubers or rhizomes. Those are deep down in the soil, and they will have to be treated some other way than by just putting out mulch. The other issue with mulch, especially the organic mulches, is they have to be replenished yearly. And this is a case where somebody who's not able to do that might choose to use some kind of inorganic mulch. Well, when you're putting out these organic mulches, how deep do you want to go? Well, the recommended rate is no more than 2 to 4 inches deep. I like about 3 inches. And that means total inches. So if you've already got mulch on your yard and they put down 3 inches last year and you've had slow decomposition and you still have 2 inches, you don't need to put down 3 more inches. You only want maybe to put down another 1 or 2 inches. With inorganic mulches, you want to keep that no more than 3 inches. And if you happen to have some kind of geotextile, some kind of landscape cloth put down, you don't want to do any more than 2 inches. But in general, if you have the option, do not use landscape cloth at all. It's better not to use it. It's better to just use the mulch by itself. So that's how deep you want it, but how do you know how much to get for your yard, for your garden area? So you want to kind of do a calculation about how much square footage or square yards you have to cover, and then know that 1 cubic yard will cover about 100 square feet of area up to a depth of about 3 inches with bark mulch, and pine straw bale will cover about 35 square feet. You don't have to stick with one kind. It's okay to mix and match. If you've got a open wooded area, you might prefer to use pine straw, which is a little bit more economical for a large area, and use more of the bark mulch in your, or wooded mulch in your garden bed. The bark mulch is going to add more and build your soil faster than the pine straw will. The pine straw has a little bit less nutrition in it, so it won't build your soil quite as quickly. But there are cases where that is the better mulch to use depending on the situation. Does anybody know what this is? This is what we call the dreaded mulch volcano. Do not do this. You may see it around town and think, oh, that's what all these professional landscapers are doing, so that must be right. Well, no, this is not right. This is incorrect in so many different ways. This is very harmful to your trees, actually, for many reasons. First of all, you do not want to put the mulch directly against your tree trunk. It holds in moisture, creates an environment for disease. When the mulch is this deep, look how deep it is. I said no more than 3 inches. Oh, goodness, this must be about 18 inches deep. You get a slight rainfall, that water is never going to reach down here to the roots. So the water is never going to get to the roots. And then those roots are saying, hey, I'm thirsty, I'm thirsty. And so they're going to start growing up into this mulch. Then they can dry out really quickly. So they're going to die, or they're available for fungi and rodents to chew on and strip away that bark and chew those roots, so leading to premature tree death. So this is never a good idea. There are some other myths around mulch that you may have heard. Obviously, the first one with the volcanoes is that some is good, more is better. Well, no, so we've already dispelled that myth. Too much of a good thing has its consequences. Some people think that wood bark can attract termites. Well, termites generally prefer higher quality wood, so that's not really the case. So it is safe to use wood bark around your home. Also, for a long time, I used to hear that pine straw, because it's acid, will make your soil acid. Well, no, we already have acid soil in this area based on our climate conditions. That's what leads to a lot of the acidity. In reality, the pine straw is first acted on and neutralized by microbes. So it is not going to make your soil more acidic. You want to be aware of using certain mulches in different places. And just to raise your awareness that pine straw can be a fire hazard. A number of years ago, there was a huge fire in an apartment complex in Raleigh that spread very quickly because they had used pine straw for landscaping. And I believe Raleigh has actually passed ordinances against using pine straw in apartment landscapes around the apartment buildings. That's just something to be aware of. Also, just wanted to throw this in here, location of where you store your mulch pile. I already talked about you want to keep it dry, but you also want to make sure that when it's delivered, they're not going to block you from getting in and out of your garage. Okay, so in summary, here's a few takeaways. So you're stuck with your soil texture, but clay soil is not so bad. It holds nutrients and moisture, stuff will grow in it, and it can be amended and improved over time. Now, if you happen to be in one of those areas that have sandy soil, hey, it drains quickly, but it doesn't hold those nutrients. It does then need more frequent addition of the organic matter. However, it can also be amended and improved over time. You want to know what you have, so get tested. Soil tests are free from April to November. Organic matter, organic matter, organic matter. It's the key. You want to add it every year. Don't overdo it. That can cause some issues as well, but generally around here, it turns over very quickly. So you absolutely need to add it at least once a year. And just keep in mind, there are no quick fixes, but success is within reach. Mulch, I think, is magic. It comes down to personal preference and your specific situation about what kind you want to use based on aesthetics, expense. Just remember that organic mulch builds your soil, and it depends on your landscape, on different situations that you might have about what particular type of mulch you want to choose. I'd like to thank Gina Myers and Joe Neal for providing me with some of their slides and pictures to use in this talk. And I want to provide you with a couple of additional resources that I found to be very helpful. There are lots of good books on soils available. This just happens to be one that I have. It's called Secrets to Great Soil by Elizabeth Stell. It's available on Amazon as well, I'm guessing in bookstores. Another great gardening source is the North Carolina Extension Gardener Handbook. This book is available for purchase. It covers everything about gardening that you might want to know. It's available in hard copy for purchase, but it's also available for free online. Another great source of information is the Cooperative Extension Service website on soils. It's gardening.ces.ncsu.edu/soils. This will have a link to the garden handbook as well from this site. It tells you all kinds of information about general soils information. It tells you everything you need to know about soil testing, getting that test done, fertilizers, and much, much more. So if you need additional information, that is also a great resource to go to. All right, well, I have one more plug I want to put in there, and this is A Gardener's Guide Month by Month. This is a brand new publication that was put together by the Extension Master Gardeners of Wake County. A couple dozen people worked on this publication. It has information on mulch and other garden basics. but it also tells you month by month what to do for different categories, including your trees and shrubs, your lawns, your annuals, your perennials, and vegetables. So each month it tells you what to do for those different categories. There are how-to diagrams and helpful tips. There are QR codes throughout that will lead you to sources of vetted information for more information about different topics. And on top of all that, it is beautifully illustrated. This is available for $20 at various garden centers in the area. I know Logan's and Campbell Road have it. And if you don't see it, just ask your garden center about it. Okay, I am now ready to answer any questions if I can. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Cynthia. That was really great. We got a bunch of questions that have come in, and they're all really good questions. So we'll just get started with some of these in the chat. The first one from Karen Andre. She says, I bought some bagged raised bed soil this year. Veggies did horrible, grew very tall and thin. Green bean leaves were chlorotic. Didn't get much produce. Some perennials did okay, others did not. The ingredients were recycled forest products, coir, perlite, dehydrated poultry manure, composted poultry manure, hydrolyzed feather meal, peat moss, kelp meal, worm castings, and bat guano, pH 5.8 to 7. Wondering if this can be amended for next year.
Whoa, okay. I need to read that. It was a lot of information.
Sure, yeah. That was sent in at 10:08 a.m.
Okay, hold on a second. Okay. Whoops. Okay, let me expand this. Okay, bagged raised soils. Okay, I have heard about this. Yes, I think this was contaminated soil. A lot of people had problems with that, so I am aware about that. I think it will, after about a year or so, it should be okay. So I'm not sure if you can remove some of it, that would be probably the best thing to do to start with. It should probably dissipate after a year. The toxins will leach out and things like that. So I don't know that just amending it is the best thing necessarily, but yeah, I guess that would help with the organic material that's in there. But it already has a lot of that in there with the peat moss and the kelp meal, so it's got a lot of organic material in there. What I would probably do is try to remove what you can, but it's going to break down over the next year, and so most of those toxic components should probably be leached out by that time. What you want to do in the future is maybe do a test before you put out a lot of this material. I think this was unusual that they had this problem, but I have heard about it. And tomatoes are very susceptible to it. So you can always do like a little pot with a tomato, and that might be one way of testing to make sure if your tomato looks like it's growing normally, that will be safe to use. But yes, that was a big issue this past year.
Awesome. Okay, Mark Robinson's asking, do you have any knowledge or experience about adding Carolina perlite or to clay soils? Is it safe for growing veggies after you add it?
I'm going to say I have no idea. Somebody else can answer that. I'm not a big veggie gardener. I do more of ornamentals, and I'm not familiar with those products, so I'm not able to answer that.
Okay. Chris Chrisman's asking, I've been experimenting with Korean natural farming and the theory that we can increase the number of indigenous microbes without digging the soil through drenching with mixtures designed to grow indigenous microbes and spraying with indigenous microbes. What do you think about no dig and creating natural fertilizers?
I think that sounds fine. Again, I'm not an expert on that, but certainly adding these microbes, that is exactly what you want. You want to make sure that they have something to live on. So you want to still add that organic matter. That's what they're going to be using for their nutrition as well. But that sounds fine. And no digging is great. That's the whole idea of mulch, is you don't want to dig, and it will help build your soil. And certainly digging is going to destroy the structure of your soil. So I think that sounds fine. That does remind me of another point that I do want to make between amending your soil and digging into your soil for amending, as well as putting the organic matter on the top of the soil. When you are planting, that is the time you want to amend, to put that organic matter into your soil. But you don't want to do it on a hole by hole basis, like as individual plants, because that creates that effect where you have the two different soil surfaces coming together and can create sort of a bowl effect. If you've got like a lot of clay, it's going to affect your drainage. So if you're going to amend soil, you want to do it in a larger bed type area. That's when you want to do that. Otherwise, it's really more advisable. You put your plant in and kind of treat it from the top with mulch.
Nice. Candace asked a question that kind of piggybacks off of that. She says she moved into a home with an established landscape. The soils are sandy. What's the best way to amend without damaging the existing plants?
Okay, I said it over and over. Add organic matter to the top. Just add it. And with sand, you'll probably have to do it a little bit more often than with clay, because you have that quick breakdown and leaching, but you just want to keep at it. Add organic matter to the top. Mulch, mulch, mulch.
Okay. Candy's asking, do chemical fertilizers lose power? How long do they last? Okay,
so if you remember back to my beautiful slide and explanation about cation exchange capacity, wait, maybe, are you asking in the soil or are you asking in storage?
Oh, that's interesting. That's interesting. She doesn't specify.
Okay, I think in storage they're probably fine.
I'm sorry, it's Candy. I meant the stuff that's been in the garage for 5 years. Is there any point in using it, etc.?
Okay. I would say it's probably going to depend on how it's been stored. So if you've had a lot of moisture, I think it is going to break down. If it's been stored in dried conditions, it might be okay. So again, you could do a little test it out, put it in a pot and see if your plant looks better. then you'll know it still works.
Thanks.
Okay. So Chris is asking, after a few years, every gardener I know finds their soil has too much phosphorus and potassium. Is this because of adding compost that does not have the right carbon-nitrogen ratio? If not, what's happening?
Okay, that's a good question. So they've done a soil test, I guess, so that's how they know that's what they have. Yeah, I mean, that certainly could be from the compost. Those things don't move through the soil as readily, I guess, so they can build up. Yeah, I'm not an expert in that either, so sorry.
Okay. James is asking, if soil around the house is compacted, can you till in organic compost and both nourish the soil and restore air content, or would you be better off just top dressing?
Okay, so it depends what you're trying to do. If you're starting from scratch and you don't have anything growing there, and you probably could do that. It's a lot of work. Adding more organic material from the top is going to help. But yeah, if it's compacted, that would help. You get the air in it that way. So that is recommended. I mean, certainly we aerate our lawns is something that's recommended to do every year. I don't see that it would hurt your bed as long as you've got nothing there. You're just starting from scratch. Okay. That would be good. Because then you can amend everything, just kind of make it all nice.
Nice. Okay, Albert's asking how you manage mulch at the end of the growing season. Do you till it into the soil or do you just let it go?
Okay, I'm assuming he's talking more like about a vegetable garden. So in your general landscape, no, you just leave it there and it's going to decompose, and that's going to help with what's going to build your soil. You just want to leave it there.
Okay.
And for a vegetable garden, that would be if you want to till your vegetable garden. Again, as somebody mentioned, every time you till, you are disturbing the structure. But if you're going to till it in and then let it sit for a while, it could help restore that.
Right. Thanks. I was referencing a vegetable garden.
Nice. Okay. James Goodman is talking about converting a rather large chunk of turf to, I guess, more garden beds. And it's going to take a good long while, but they're asking what's a good cost-effective method they can use to protect the ground from erosion. while also helping build the soil. They ask specifically, is chip drops a good solution?
It's not turf. It's actually all bare ground. We've never planted. So we're starting with a blank slate.
Okay, yeah, I think that would be great. Yeah, any kind of organic material you can put on top is going to help. So yeah, chip drop, I've heard of that, is great.
Okay. Mary McNamara is asking, do you have any anecdotal stories about snakes in mulch, pine bark versus bark?
Never had an issue. Never. I've been gardening over 30 years, never had snakes in the mulch.
Sure. Well, if anybody has stories about snakes in their mulch, please feel free to put them in the chat. We would love to hear about them. Okay. I will read this from Maryland Gist. It says, if I want to mulch an existing bed that has pine straw and maybe a few leaves, but mostly pine straw, that has fallen from the nearby trees, do I need to rake or remove the pine straw before applying either composted leaf mulch or decomposed arborist wood chips?
No, that is entirely up to you. If you're going to, it depends how much residue is there. If you've got a lot of pine straw and you're going to put the mulch on it and you don't want that look, then you might want to rake it away, but it's not going to harm. It's still going to break down underneath that mulch layer. So you do not need to remove it. That's just a choice on your part, whether it's going to show through and you don't like the way it looks, or if it's not going to bother you, or if it's not going to show through, then I would leave it.
Okay. Carol's asking you to comment on the use of ground cover versus mulch. I assume like a landscape fabric or other inorganic ground covers rather than.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure if they mean like a natural, like a growing ground cover.
Or that, yeah.
Yeah. So first of all, we don't recommend using landscape material. So it's really, it impedes the water flow. It's really not going to build what's underneath your soil. It's going to break down and put stuff into your ground. So really don't recommend using landscape cloth to begin with. But if you're talking about natural ground covers, like different plants that you're growing, that's fine. I mean, I when I started with a ground cover, you still kind of want to mulch around it. I would use like some kind of chips or shredded bark around your ground cover as it's growing, because that's what's going to build the soil. You're trying to grow those plants. You want them to have that good structure as well. I hope that answered that question.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. Carol's asking, do you agree that the roots of annuals should remain in the soil at the end of the season? She says a speaker noted that the roots will decompose and improve the soil.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that. And I tend to leave my annuals. It depends. Like, I mean, sometimes when I'm pulling off the tops, the whole thing will come up, and okay, so then I just get rid of it. But if I can get it off the top of it and just leave the roots there, yeah, I do that. And I agree. It's in the soil. It's going to break down and just add to your organic material and structure. So I think it's fine. The only issue is if you're going to plant some, like if you're going from the summer annual to a winter annual, you're going to dig in the same place, you're going to possibly disturb it anyway. It might be in the way. You might want to get rid of them. But other than that, yeah, I agree. I think that's a good idea.
Nice. Okay. Anne is asking, well, in reference to that book, A Gardener's Guide, she's saying, can it be used for Maryland gardeners?
For Maryland gardeners? Is that what
yeah.
Yeah, it's designed for the Piedmont, but it includes zones 7 and 8, and Maryland, I believe, is included in that. So yes, I would say yes.
Cool. Nancy's asking about Espoma brand products, Holly Tone and Plant Tone specifically. She says the bag says it's organic. Is it? ?
Okay, so again, that's a good question, because I've used those products too. I think they're generally good products. I think I'm going to say, you know what? I hadn't really thought about that. I'm not sure how they're derived. What they mean by organic on those particular products. Usually when you think about organic fertilizer, you're thinking about things like manure and compost, which have organic components. So I'll have to look at those. That's a good question. I have to read the label and see what it says.
Sure,
That's
definitely.
what they claim. That's what they claim.
Right? No
So,
kidding.
so if indeed it is, quote, organic, then what that means, it can mean a couple things. Maybe it means that it's not derived from a petroleum product, that it was derived from a natural product and they've somehow purified it so that it's ready to go. Or it can mean, like what I said, is when you use an organic fertilizer, you have to wait for the microorganisms to act on it to release those components into the soil to make them available for the plant. So I don't know which it is, but I'm guessing it's one of those two things.
Thank you. I just ask it because of how you defined an organic fertilizer. So great. It's very helpful. And I think it's also not derived from petroleum products.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Nice. Okay, we got a couple people that are asking about sourcing organic materials in bulk. One person said specifically, like the big box stores only sell the colored nuggets.
Oh.
They're wondering, where can you find shredded mulch?
Okay, so actually, if you look hard enough, you can find the bags of natural mulch at the big box stores. I've seen it because we bought it before when we needed fill. I usually get mine delivered by a Arborist or some other source in the spring and put it out. So there are lots of sources. Some will charge you for it, usually for the higher quality stuff. Chip drop, people mentioned that. They actually give you chips for free, but you don't necessarily know what quality it's going to be, but it is free. But there are places, you can just look online for local sources that sell bulk mulch. There's lots
Nice.
of sources.
Okay, Susan Silver is asking, how do you know if leaf mulch has gone bad or gone sour? Is it by smell?
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, yeah, I guess by smell. I don't know. Yeah, I haven't used leaf mulch that much myself, so I don't know if it seems like it has a little more air in it, so I don't know, but it could. But again, it would be something, if you think that it is, if it smells bad or seems off to you, just do a little test with putting it near get a little test plant to use and test it in one area and see if it's going to hurt that plant or not.
Nice. Okay, Sharon is asking, how soon can shredded tree material be used from a recently cut tree?
Okay, that's an excellent question. A lot of people, you may be aware that when materials like that are fresh, what happens is that the organisms that are breaking it down actually take up all that nitrogen because they need it to act on that mulch that's fresh. And so it's going to deplete some of the nitrogen from the soil. And depending on what kind of material you're starting with, depends on what kind of organisms. And so so I don't know how long you have to leave it, but you can compensate for it by adding nitrogen from another source if you need to. Probably leaving it 6 months to a year is probably okay.
Nice. Rachel's asking, does Roundup affect the soil quality after the plants sprayed are dead?
Okay, so what happens with Roundup is I talked about how, especially if you have clay, how good clay is at binding things, and it will bind to the clay that will make it inactive. So it will not be available to harm anything else once it's in the soil and your other plants are dead. So it's not active anymore.
Okay. Mark is asking, how do we get the month-by-month book in Concord, North Carolina area, or just like outside of North Carolina generally? Do you have any advice for those of us outside the Piedmont?
Cynthia, I can speak to that if you'd
Go
like.
ahead, Anne, please.
Okay. If you'd like to email me at Anne, A-N-N-E, Conley, C-O-N-L-E-Y, at me.com, and you send me your address, I'd be happy to put it in the mail to you. We do charge an additional $5 when we mail them. And I'll send you how to make the check payable and where to send the check to, and then I'll put the check in the mail to you.
Yeah,
I mean, I'll put the book in the mail to you.
And would you put your email in the chat? So
Yes.
have that. That'd be great.
Good idea.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Anne. Okay. Cynthia from Carol, are you a fan of feather meal and fish emulsion?
I've never used either, so I no opinion.
No kidding. No kidding. Okay. And I believe that is all of the questions that we have here in the chat. So with that, I'd like to thank you so much, Cynthia, for this incredibly informative talk. We were all captivated. Oh, hold on a second. There's a big one that just came in. Would you like to do one more question for us, Cynthia?
Sure, go ahead.
So this is from Marilyn. She says, I inherited an area under dogwood trees that was planted with liriope and vinca minor when I moved here 35 years ago. I found that adding in organic mulch in winter really makes a big difference as to how well the dogwoods do in the summer droughts. I use pine bark soil conditioner because the particles are small enough to not smother the ground covers and fall to the ground. I can buy it in bulk from places like Mulch Masters. Oh, this isn't even a question. Okay. In bags at a big box store or garden centers. Well, great. Thank you so much for that, Marilyn. That's some good information that people were actually looking for. So great. Thanks again. Okay. And thank you, Cynthia, for this lecture. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. My pleasure. I enjoyed it.
Yes, and we will be posting this recording to our YouTube page, if not today, then tomorrow. So if you want to review this information, you will have that opportunity, and just be on the lookout on our YouTube page. So thanks again, everybody, for joining us today. Thank you, Cynthia, for doing this talk for us. We greatly appreciate it. And I hope you all have a beautiful rest of your week.
Thanks, Cynthia.
Thank you. Bye.